taking off so early?
Oh, what?
Leaving so soon?
No, I had to drop off.
Oh, okay. Okay, everybody, should we get started? Ready? Oh, thank you for coming today. I'm sure you're all very excited about next week, but today we're going to continue to talk about psychological disorders. I want to remind everybody that there is an extra credit project in play. It's one that's only lasts for a short period of time. Takes how long does it take, guys, to finish this extra credit project? 20 minutes? Okay, thank you. I did extend its due date till Sunday at noon because for some reason yesterday morning it stopped working, and so it was the end of the day before I could get to fix it. And so you have till Sunday, not night, Sunday noon to get it finished, because I need to be able to look at it and make it into data that we can then use on Monday, right? Okay, so we were talking about, I hear singing. Singing is very nice. Who is singing? Oh, I enjoyed that. I would like a good song every now and then. That's perfectly fine. Anyways, we're talking about psychological disorders beyond its definition. We said that psychologists are interested in naming it, identifying the cause, the prognosis, and how to treat it. We're going to, mainly we're going to focus on how to name it and how to treat it. And we started with a discussion of anxiety. We said here's the long list of disorders that currently are listed in the data and statistical manual of mental disorders that psychologists and psychiatrists use. And we're going to really touch base on anxiety, depression, and we did already speak a little bit about personality disorders, right? So when we talked about anxiety disorders, we just gotten started and talked about the fact that when you say somebody has anxiety, first question you have to ask is, what kind of anxiety? Because there are many different types of anxieties that each present a different syndrome. And the idea is that things that vary by syndrome probably also vary in causality and therefore prognosis and treatment. And so psychologists right now have come to the decision that these are in fact 5 separate types of anxiety, and they all share a common characteristic, which is some sort of anxiety and fear-related emotional response or some sort of avoidance response. So all of these would be negative emotional responses, more or less, but they also are responses that we use whenever we're in the fight or flight mode, right? And so it has suggested that the cause of this function may be a supersensitive or some sort of change in that fight or flight response that we talked about when we discussed for emotions. What I'd like to do today is focus on what are the symptomatic categories of these different disorders. I sort of briefly described them the other day, and I'll go into a little bit more detail now. The first one we're going to talk about is general anxiety disorder, or GAD, and this is the most common form of anxiety disorders. It is characterized as someone who has prolonged, like every day, all day, for long periods of time. They have sort of this vague, intense fear, right? They may not even describe themselves as fearful, but they tend to be terribly hypervigilant. They're always looking off their shoulder. They're looking for some problem to develop, and it makes them uncomfortable, right? And usually it's directed towards a particular topic, like being in a social situation, or being in a classroom situation, or being at work, or being with a particular family member, that sort of thing, or a particular person. And so it is sort of directed, but less directed than when we talk about phobias, right? It's not a specific item. It's more like a general context that's making them hypervigilant, so they're always looking over their shoulder, and they have this kind of low-level anxiety kind of all of the time. And they must also, to be diagnosed with GAD, you must also show these sort of behavioral cognitive problems. You should have a high degree of restlessness, muscle tension, fatigue, you're tired, you have poor abilities to concentrate, you're apprehensive, you often have sleep disturbances and irritability. No, you only need 3 because it's not the case that you always see all of these things. But to get diagnosed with GAD, you have to have some sort of generalized fear and anxiety towards a context, really, and then at least 3 of these other symptoms. And I just always think it's interesting because clinicians that I know have often concurred and said that people who come in with general anxiety disorder often start by saying they feel sick and they feel achy, like they've got arthritis or something, right? But they're often way too young or they don't have any other symptoms of arthritis. And so some people have used that actually to sort of ask the question is, could this be associated with the general immune response? Because when your immune system becomes active, you do get achy all over, right? And so people have sort of started to look at that as a possible underlying etiology for some of these symptoms. The reason I mention that is if you think about it, it's probably not the case that your immune system is causing anxiety. Something is causing it, and it's causing an immune response, which then is giving you the symptoms. And you need to see, I want you to appreciate that the symptoms can kind of be far away from the cause sometimes, right? And so we only have symptoms by which to diagnose these things at this point. You got to be careful about jumping to what the cause is, because the cause can be kind of logically followed from the symptoms, but it doesn't have to, as in that example I just gave you. And they often have they also have an enhanced startle response. But interestingly enough, we now know that in the population there's a slight increase in the number of people that experience post-traumatic stress disorder, or they're diagnosing it more often now as separate from general anxiety disorder. And those individuals also show a highly enhanced startle reflex. And what do I mean by that? If someone comes up behind you and says, boo, and you jump, right? And that is expected and probably normal in lots of conditions, but it sort of depends. If you're in a crowded area and somebody does that, it means that you must have been really focused on something, or you maybe have an enhanced startle response. Okay. About phobias. So phobias are different because they induce a paralyzing fear. And so people with phobia do show high anxiety, but they often can't move, they freeze, or if they start to move, they persevere on one specific topic and how afraid they are. Their fear is just excessive, persistent, and irrational to everybody standing around them. And these are some listings, kind of fun listings of common phobias that you tend to see. They're often directed at some specific event or situation. I think I told you that I'm terrified of sharks. I think likely because I lived through the 70s when all those Jaws movies came out. And I told you that I ran into a shark down in Clearwater, Florida, baby shark. And then I was in Mexico when there was a hammerhead shark. Every day somebody was losing a limb because it had gotten stuck inside the bay. The bay is normally protected from sharks, but this one had gotten in. And so every day we were reading about who got eaten by the shark that day. And I think all of those things combined, because they all happened at about the same age, was sufficient for me to have a healthy phobia of sharks, which is sort of ridiculous when you live in the middle of the country in the United States. When am I going to run into a shark? But maybe that's super smart from my ego's point of view, because my ego tucked away a whole bunch of fears in something that I could never run into, right? Too bad my ego didn't realize I like to travel. Anyways, it's often associated with this high degree of avoidance, which you don't see with general anxiety disorder. People with general anxiety disorder sometimes are approaching their fearful stimulus a lot as well. And I just think it's fun. You probably all are familiar with claustrophobia, right? And you probably all know about acrophobia. There's also zoophobia, which I think is fun. There's a flying phobia, and I like brontophobia, fear of thunder and lightning, man, right? Okay. There is a kind of phobia, social anxiety disorders, this name slightly different, social anxiety disorders, which appears to be a fear of public places that has many of the same symptoms as a general phobia, and often diagnosed under that category. Fear of being alone is another type of different kind of phobia that's more recent, where people try to escape from public situations and places. Again, has many of the symptoms of a phobia, even though it doesn't have the name of phobia, is generally diagnosed under that category. And finally, your book talks about the fact that they really do think of these as three subtypes: the social phobias, the specific phobias, which is what this graph is showing you, and agoraphobias. These are social interaction. As opposed to being in a social place, this is about having social interactions with people. Okay. And phobias, so general anxiety disorder is the most common. Phobias are also not one of the more common types of anxiety disorders you see. And then sort of third in the list of frequency is panic disorder, and these are reoccurring attacks we talked about the other day, where the person appears terrorized, like that's how frightened they are. They're often sudden, they are unpredictable, and the individual experiencing the panic disorder may not really have a good idea of what's setting it off, right? It often includes this really significantly speedy onset of the sympathetic nervous system and can be induced by anything that activates the sympathetic nervous system. It doesn't have to be some sort of psychological cue or psychological state or event or any of that. If you give somebody who is prone to panic disorders an injection of, say, epinephrine to activate their sympathetic nervous system, it will throw them into a really extreme response to that drug, indicating a panic disorder. It often includes, so one of the ways you can tell it apart from phobias and general anxiety disorders, it comes with catastrophic thinking that seems unreasonable to anyone listening. It induces a high degree of avoidance behavior and is often comorbid with agoraphobia, one of the interesting things. And so these are people who go out into social situations, and the social situation is a phobia for them. But in addition to having all the standard phobia responses about going, once they get there, they go into a panic attack, right? So it's very unpleasant for those people. Now, a less common anxiety disorder is obsessive compulsive disorder, which for a long time was kind of listed as its own psychological disorder, but now is considered part of the anxiety disorder syndromes. And obsessive compulsive disorder is a disorder of thoughts and behaviors. This has two components. One is a thought or thinking component, and one is a compulsive component. And the behaviors are, the thoughts are often anxiety provoking, but the combination of the thoughts and the behavior help the individual avoid something. They help them avoid anxiety all the time. And so the behaviors are generally such kind of like motivated behaviors that get you to do something so you don't have to think about it, basically. And so by thinking about it, you would have anxiety. By avoiding thinking about it, then you can reduce your anxiety. And so in obsessive compulsive disorder, the obsession is the involuntary thought or the idea that reoccurs, despite the individual's attempt to stop it, despite saying, oh, I know I didn't leave the stove on. What are you thinking about? I know I didn't leave the stove on, right? And you just can't stop them. Or did I turn off the iron? Even though you remember turning off the iron, you just can't suppress that thought until you go and check it again. And that's the compulsive behavior, some sort of repetitive, realistic behavior that a person feels compelled to perform, and they can't feel okay about turning off the iron until they check it again. And this, the most common compulsive behaviors are checking behaviors, washing, like washing your hands behaviors, just generally. And individuals with a severe case of obsessive compulsive disorder often have to check many times, whereas the rest of us, really college students in general, and faculty and various people in more of higher education often express some compulsive behavior. It's possible that studying and being a good college student happens to encourages some compulsive disorder. I know that to be a good scientist, every student has to become more compulsive over their training. I've seen that happen endless amounts of time. But in these cases, the amount of repetitive behavior is minimal. You might have to check once, and the obsessions aren't following you forever, right? You can turn them on and off a little bit more easy. So I think that, like we talked about mental health being on a continuum, obsessive compulsive disorders in our society at this one time have some positive perks. And so you often see kind of a low level of this kind of phenomenon. We wouldn't call it a disorder. It wouldn't be sufficient to make that claim, but it certainly has these symptoms that's happening at a low frequency that maybe is actually beneficial to the individual. And I think this sort of ties in with this idea we talked about that some people, from an evolutionary perspective, suggest that some things that we call mental disorders today would actually be productive, helpful behaviors in other contexts, just not the current context. Key aspect of OCD person's experience is that if they're unable to complete their ritual, they do develop an anxiety disorder that can take that form of a panic disorder or even just a generalized anxiety disorder. And so if you stop them from doing it, get ready for a grumpy person for some period of time, okay? And someone who's uneasy and not feeling well. Okay, and then the last one to talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, this was something that was sort of seen as its own disorder for a while, and it now has been recognized as being more part of the family of anxiety disorders. And in this case, it involves memory, which may or may not be different than the other disorders, but in terms of symptoms, they talk about it, there has to be some reoccurring memory of a traumatic event. And what's interesting about post-traumatic stress disorder is that when you look at the the antecedent things that may have caused it, right? It's often caused by a single event, right? Not always, though. So who suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder? This is a big problem for the military because lots of people who experience military action where there are loud sounds along with concussive type airwaves. So, if a sound gets loud enough, it actually activates the entire touch system as well, in addition to the hearing system. And when you have stimuli like that, such as a bomb blowing up, right, this tends to increase the probability of post-traumatic stress disorder to a much higher event. And so you see a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder in military personnel who have come back from active duty. And it's not just that concussive sound. I think so I have used a number of animal models for this disorder. And more recently, they've started to talk about you need to have not only that concussive, loud sound, but you also have to have some pre-existing fear or anxiety about the situation that you're in, right? Which makes some sense, right? You have to be worried about it to begin with, maybe in a normal way because you're in a situation where harm may occur to you, and then kind of get surprised by this concussive sound. But we also know that we get lots of post-traumatic stress disorder in people who have had repeated exposures to traumatic events that maybe aren't as extreme. And these are people who are young adults where you see post-traumatic stress disorder, and if you look at their life during their childhood, they've been physically abused substantially or sexually abused substantially. And so this is the other bigger group that shows post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're re-experiencing multiple traumatic events, and they sum up somehow to give them these level of symptoms. We also know that any sort of sexual abuse, like in college, people who are sexually raped several times in college often develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And also the other big group are people that have car accidents. And that's maybe not surprising because a car accident is often accompanied by momentarily a short period of fear, and then followed by a loud concussive sound of the accident itself, right? And so these are where you mainly see post-traumatic stress disorder. Also you would expect it to happen in civilians that are in military zones where there's active fighting going on, or as a consequence of any sort of terrorist attack, you'd expect to see an increase in post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms generally are, besides that they have these repeated memories of the trauma itself that they just can't look away from. They can't get it to get out of their memory. It becomes a very strong memory. They think about it every day. But in addition, they have these very enhanced startle effects, and they have more fear in general to everything. So they're hypervigilant. In addition, they have a lot more of fear avoidance to even small things that happen in their environment, things that you wouldn't maybe even react to. And their overall stress response, like how they mediate those hormones of stress, has a totally different pattern than you'd expect in individuals without post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? And so these theories, there's a lot of theories on what causes the different anxiety disorders, but as is true to the DSM-5, it does appear that most groups find that the actual causal mechanism for excuse me. Not good, but probably not anything serious. Okay. All right. In any event, they all seem to think it comes from slightly different components. So for example, from the biological perspective, you can often show a high concordance rate of these disorders among identical twins. And so if each one of those disorders in a twin, you have a much higher likelihood to be in both twins than just one twin. It does vary between the different disorders to some extent, and the genetic component is small across the board, right? But there does appear to be a significant genetic component in all of them. Individuals with anxiety disorders often have an atypical sympathetic nervous system responsivity and sensitivity. I mentioned that in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but the reactivity of the sympathetic nervous system in all those other anxiety disorders is typically very different than someone who's not being diagnosed with one of those disorders. They are hypervigilant, basically, in general, or they have a hyper fear response. And remember, that fear response is, again, that pathway that emotional pathway for fight or flight that we talked about. And I never know what quite to make of that. If there's somebody that's experiencing anxiety frequently, they may be enhancing the activity of that area of their brain because they're in that anxious state substantially, and there may be long-term consequences to activating your brain in that area multiple times. In the case of GAD and panic disorders, drugs that improve the activity of the neurotransmitter GABA tend to be helpful. Interestingly enough, this until very recently, this was the primary way in which they controlled anxiety attacks, was by giving depressant drugs, right, like benzodiazepines or Valium. These are kind of common drugs that they would give. That actually is on the down low now because these drugs produce such high rates of addiction liability and are often then combined with alcohol, which can be lethal in a large percentage of the population. And so while we know that GABA, enhancing GABA neurotransmission is helpful, it is not really right now there's a huge debate about whether it should be a go-to treatment for GAD or panic disorders. And I just mention this because it is very new. And so in medicine, in the primary care of medicine, they're all still prescribing these GAD, benzodiazepines, and they often interact really badly with other drugs that the individual may be taking, which they're probably taking to control their panic disorders as well, like alcohol. And so the whole system is trying to move off that now. So if you go in today, you may get a benzodiazepine. But if you went to see a psychiatrist, they'd give you some other drug that doesn't have that liability of addiction. OCD is improved by giving drugs that change serotonin levels in the prefrontal cortex. We know that specifically. We know that the change in serotonin isn't induced directly by the drugs. The drugs kind of act to do something outrageous to the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex then responds to that. And that response calms down OCD symptoms. So it usually takes 3 to 4 weeks for the drugs to work, while these kind of rapid neural adaptations are occurring. And the neural adaptations need to be induced by largely increases and then decreases of serotonin level that are in response to being given some standard serotonin drug, like Prozac, for example. Although they have dozens of these drugs now, and they tend to test to see which one's going to work best on individuals with OCD. And in case of post-traumatic stress disorder, we know that there are lots of neuroanatomical changes in the hippocampus, which, remember, that's just part of memory systems, right? And that's consistent with these flashback memory systems that they have. We don't have a very effective way pharmacologically to treat those symptoms yet, other than giving them a GABA agonist, like you might do for all of these. But we know that that's not really very helpful. They've tried a lot of different things, and the research that I did on the topic of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, we were looking into the efficacy of MDMA, which is ecstasy, which they do actually now prescribe. I think the FDA does allow you to prescribe ecstasy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Our research, though, to us, which was in an animal model, did suggest that it does also modify social behaviors in a way that may be, in the long term, kind of negative for these individuals. So we were a little bit concerned about that, but our research did not win, huh? So when people take ecstasy, they feel like it's an attactogenic compound, right? They feel like they get closer to people. But in fact, in animal models, they do not. They get farther away. So the perception is they're having a better social interaction. Their perception is that they're touching people, which we know is important for relationship formation. But in fact, it's not actually happening. And so over prolonged periods of time, when they finally stop taking the ecstasy, their social behaviors are not particularly well corrected. And that's a problem for people with PTSD. They kind of scare people off, and they have a lot of social withdrawal issues because people are withdrawing from them because of their strong reaction to very kind of small stimuli in the environment, right? But it does maybe acutely make them feel less. It's a serotonin drug predominantly, so it may acutely make them feel much less anxious, right? Okay, and so the behaviorists, of course, think that the problem with anxiety disorder is some sort of bad learning. And they're not wrong, that you can often for someone backtrack their anxiety to a particular event where they may have made some underlying association. In this case, they think that the problem is with associative learning specifically, which is often unconscious. We don't really pay much attention to what we learn through associative learning. It's not generally aware to us. And so the idea here is that some sort of aberrant classical conditioning has occurred. Something has happened that was quite aversive, and the cues around that aversive task have now become salient to you, so that every time you see these cues, which are really neutral, right, you have an appropriate response to them as if that aversive event is also occurring. But then in classical conditioning, we often generalize. Don't forget about little Albert, right? He heard a horribly loud, probably concussive sound behind his head when he saw his first white rat with little beady red eyes. And thereafter, he couldn't even smile at Santa Claus, right? He just generalized that phenomena. And so if you think about something like general anxiety disorder and then also post-traumatic stress disorder, you can imagine how that kind of learning could lead to some pathological behavioral state. They also think that operant conditioning can be at play here in anxiety disorders, so that you are basically being rewarded for your anxiety behavior, basically. Meaning sometimes in our environment, being hypervigilant means that you catch on to something before somebody else does, and maybe that thing would indeed be problematic, but so you get rewarded for catching on. And so now you're hypervigilant. You're always trying to catch on, and because that emergency state may exist, but it doesn't actually exist. You've just been rewarded sufficiently, so you're kind of making it up just a few minutes beforehand. Does that make any sense? Right? So it's not as helpful to you, and you're not distinguishing really the stimuli properly. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that this happens. So for example, studies like Isaac's here demonstrates that in anxious people, it's much more likely that they'll endorse a stimulus as being threatening, even when non-anxious people don't see it as threatening. And they suggest that that can happen because of learning and also thinking. So, the cognitive people kind of have a deviation from the behavioral people a little bit, and they say that, well, you don't have to actually be behaving. It doesn't have to be a full classical conditioning. It could all be, latent learning. You could observe it in somebody else and then learn that lesson that helps you think about situations differently so that you misinterpret them, you focus your attention in the wrong way, and you have selective recall. Again, reinforced by this study by Isaac saying that anxious people tend to identify things as more threatening than non-anxious people. Okay, and finally, we have the psychodynamic perspective, or I'm going to say the Freud perspective, although it's more liberal these days. And Freud would say, well, anxiety is a form of neuroses. It's a defense mechanism. He would say in individuals that express it to the point of a mental disorder, it's an ineffective defense mechanism. You induce psychic conflict and fear, and then the ego induces anxiety as a way of sort of not paying attention to the conflict. And he considered obsessive compulsive disorder as an example of a very extreme defense mechanism in this regard. So in other words, you're engaging in a behavior so that the super ego can't even talk about it, right? See what I mean? Okay. All right, so we can have a top hat. Several people have asked me for multiple top hats, so I'm trying to put a couple questions in so people can catch up their top hat. So here's one, try this. I'm only giving you 80 seconds. You need to go faster. Go faster. I don't know how that little dot got in there. What anxiety disorder is associated with prolonged, vague, intense fear and may have may be hypervigilant on a particular topic? I should have put an and in there. And may have hypervigilant behavior on one topic. By the way, we have a student ID card here. If you recently lost your student ID card, maybe it's here, okay? Oh, 37 seconds, you can do it. There's only 217 people here. We can do it. How are you? Good? Okay. Everybody looking forward to eating and eating and eating next week? Anybody have to cook and cook and cook? Not fun, right? Takes the whole holiday out of it. All right, oh, go quickly. You can do it, 4 seconds. Hopefully we got everybody by the time it finishes counting. Here we go. GAD, general anxiety disorder, is the correct answer. PTSD, we would have to have that memory component to it, right? They'd have to have that exaggerated memory that won't leave them alone. They rethink about it every day. Do you guys ever persevere on a memory? For example, have you ever gone out, done something that you decided was stupid, and you wished you had never done it, and then for the next 2 or 3 days, all you do is think about that and how you're going to respond to the next time you see those people, right? So that's PTSD magnified by weeks and months and months. Like after a couple of days, even if you do nothing about it, it will start to fade from your memory, And if you remember, a week later, you'll be like, oh, what a dummy, right? But it won't affect you more than that, right? Whereas someone with PTSD just can't get it out of their mind. And fundamentally, the trauma they may be remembering might be something that you would consider much more severe, but not always, actually, when you start to talk to them, right? Okay, so not PTSD. Yeah, anxiety is too broad of a term, not incorrect, but would be too broad for an exam. Not phobias, not OCD. So what's a phobia has to be directed towards one specific event. Can't be general, right? OCD has to involve obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors. So these are some of the ways that you can tell the difference between all these different disorders. But generally, people did a pretty good idea. I don't know what plant means. I'm going to guess you just couldn't come up with anything. I can't help you. Yes? You have an idea of what plant means?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So anxiety is like an defense mechanism or a learned behavior. Do we have a chance to unlearn it?
No, there is no such thing as unlearning, right? Mm-hmm. But can you extinguish the behavior? Yes. And that's, of course, one of the treatments they try to use on things like phobias. They try to extinguish the behavior. There are some meds that help counter conditioning. You try to learn a different lesson that will replace your lesson, right? That's pretty effective for phobias. They actually try to work more on thinking for most of the other ones when they don't use a medical treatment. Yeah. So the medical treatments exist. They aren't always very effective. I think they're pretty effective for mild cases. And they may be effective for even moderate cases, but not extreme cases, which is why psychology continues to develop new methods. And learning, using conditioning, counter-conditioning is one of the big methods that we'll talk about, yeah? Okay.
So one of the symptoms, it was memory deficit in one of the...
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
I was thinking, after we did the memory chapter, how do we know it's a memory deficit and not memory retrieval?
Oh, yeah, well, we don't know, right? We know it's a hippocampus problem. Because there are actually, in severe cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, there are notable differences in the function of the hippocampus, which is tough to find. It's, you can't look for an area. Well, they do have a suspected area of the brain for depression and anxiety and things like that. But you rarely find schizophrenia. You can see a difference in the brain, but you rarely find structural differences in the brain in any of these mental disorders, with the exception of some of the drug disorders, right? But so they don't know which part of the memory process it is. It could be retrieval, could be formation. We all know, right? I know you're all having chit-chats about how much turkey you're going to eat next week. But hold on for a second. Or maybe it's tofurkey. I don't know, whatever the ones are. But think about it this. What do we remember? What's the earliest memory you have? For most of you, it'll be something that had a high emotional content to it. We are better at remembering longer emotions because emotions might be relatively unique. You don't really have the same exact emotion every time. And so if a big emotion comes with an event, that may be a sufficient tag to keep that memory active for a long period of time. And so, these things, something like an anxiety disorder, almost always the PTSD memories come with some big, huge emotional recall system on. So it could just be recall. You don't know. The tags could be really exceptional. And maybe, it's a great question. Like, what determines how you, okay, so a lot of people, as an analogy, use memory retrieval, long-term memory, is sort of like the World Wide Web, right? It's a keyword search. You go in, you put your keywords in. So do you find for yourself that you tend to use the same keywords all the time to start any search? Are you careful about making sure your keywords go to a specific topic? Or do you have general keywords that you use? Like, for example, I often put buffalo into everything because I'm trying to see what's close around, right? It could be that our memory does work that way. And in the case of PTSD, some tag has gotten permanently embedded in the process. And so every time you go to remember anything, that tag brings you back to that memory. Does that make sense? That would be a retrieval problem. Still, we'd call it a memory problem, right? Because we just don't know. We don't know.
And I had this question. After we finished that memory, without really I was thinking about memory loss, and I was thinking maybe it's suppression, maybe it's a retrieval issue.
Yeah, it could be all of it. It could be encoding. It could be all of those things, right? unfortunately. But the fact that it's in the hippocampus does make you think it's part of the process, maybe rather than the long-term storage. That'd be the only thing I'd say, right? Right. Although it doesn't go away. There are other really interesting periods of time that the hippocampus changes. So the hippocampus is something, for example, there are structural changes to the hippocampus after you have your first child. And there are notable changes in behavior in women that we don't like to talk about after you have your first child as well. No, like just a different emphasis in life. All kinds of attitudes change. All kinds of things change. And their preferences for things change. And they look at you and they say, I know I used to love this, but ugh. It's weird, right? Just like their feet tend to grow. So all kinds of weird things happen during that time. And one is it that you're for most women, the hippocampus changes, and it's structural. They can actually see it on fMRI and those sorts of things. So it's sort of an interesting phenomenon. And I could think of other examples too in life when you're, it may be that during any kind of, I mean, no one's ever asked the question whether the hippocampus goes under some big change if you go to college, right? I don't think anyone's ever thought to look at that. But that might also be the case too, right? It's okay. Hyperfixation, no, not right. Okay, well, let's go on, let's move on and talk about mood disorders. And I should say anxiety disorders are on the rise among your subculture, and maybe others as well, maybe just your age group, or in multiple age groups. But it may just be that we're all suffering a little bit more anxiety. It's possible that anxiety is an effective strategy in multitasking in various other things, right? It may be a consequence that we don't like, but it may be making us better at something else. Does that make sense? And so really what we need to maybe focus on is how to extract that successful behavior with some other successful behavior for something like multitasking. Because multitasking has increased substantially, say, over the last 20 to 25 years. So something to think about, right? Okay, mood disorders. You also get really depressed. But that's nothing new. College students have been getting mildly depressed every semester for decades and decades. Typically, it's really interesting at the graduate level of college. There's this well-known yet not spoken about idea when I went to graduate school. So it was true up at least to the 2000s. I haven't seen any data since the 2000s. But what it was that the rate of divorce among women who went to graduate school was just astronomical. It's like 80%. But the rate of divorce among men who go to graduate school is 20%, way lower than the population level of divorce. But what was interesting to me, so you can explain why that is, that actually men benefit from having a wife when they go to graduate school, but women do not benefit from having a husband when they go to graduate school. And you all think about that all you want yourself. But what was interesting to me is that these divorces always start in December and April. This is when the problem begins. And if you start looking more broadly at people's friendships and various other bonding activities they have, this is a critical period of time for college students and their friendships, their romantic relationships, and even their relationships with their family. December and April. And I'm going to say, I think it's all your fault. I'm kidding, of course, right? But I think that this is a period of time when students are highly stressed and their mood gets depressed, and they're less tolerant to the social and productive world around them, and so they're more likely to, and the people around them may not understand that exactly the same way. So it's a period of time when more aggressive behavior, more anxiety-related behavior, more depression-related behavior can occur, and so we see these kind of big changes in things. So somebody once gave me, a clinical friend of mine, once told me that you should never make a big decision at that period of time. You should just look at people and say, you know what, I need 2 weeks and then I'll talk to you all you want, right? And try and buffer yourself from your social relationships during exam periods and things like that. It's also true in big family gatherings that those are also very stressful these days. Always best to sort of stay away from the hot topics, right? When somebody might throw turkey at you. That would definitely happen in my family. Okay, mood disturbances. Okay, so these are, of course, disturbances of emotion, just like anxiety, but this is now about the affective state. And so it's not about fight or flight. It's about hedonia, feeling good, or feeling nothing, like anhedonia, or feeling bad, right? So this is good and bad, not fight or flight. And by the way, these days, people often get diagnosed with both simultaneously, right? So there's some confusion a little bit about that happening. So these are always going to be abnormal emotional states. And remember, we're on a continuum. And so it is the case that in our society, everyone feels sadness, right? And sadness, can be described as depression, but in order to be diagnosed as a form of major depression, it would have to have lots of other symptoms. And so that most depression that is dealt with today is mild to moderate. And as a society, we treat mild to moderate depression pharmacologically all the time, and with less persistence non-pharmacologically, which is kind of too bad, because non-pharmacological treatment works better for mild and moderate than it does for extreme. Extreme needs a combination of multiple ways of treatment. But when we talk about it as an abnormal emotional state, it has to be prolonged. Pharmaceutical companies would like you to believe that's 2 weeks. I think psychologists in general would say a few months, basically. It has to be an extreme mood. When you meet somebody who's depressed, they can't have anything nice to say about anything, and generally they make you uncomfortable. If you have somebody who has severe depression, they will make you unhappy also, because they're just so unhappy. The individual who has the depression often feels overwhelmed by their emotional state. They can recognize it, they don't know what to do about it, they just can't get it out of their head, right? In addition, your book gives you this very nice diagram, and it talks about depressive episodes, and it also includes manic episodes. And so part of depression can be the reverse, the opposite, massive hedonic state, positive hedonic state, as opposed to massive anhedonic state. And most people demonstrate only the depressive end of depression, but then there's a subgroup that seems to demonstrate both kind of a cyclic depression and manic state. And then there are some that only express the manic state in a cyclic way. When they go out of the manic state, they're not in a depressive state, right? And so all of this is considered part of mood disorders, but the symptoms of depression and mania are very different. So for example, individuals with mood disorders, we could say just generally have emotional symptoms like they're dysphoric and gloomy, and they have an inability to experience pleasure. So nothing that they used to do that made them happy makes them happy now, and they feel hopeless, basically. In contrast, the emotional symptoms of someone with mania is that they're euphoric and enthusiastic, they have excessive pursuits of pleasurable activities, and they have unwarranted optimism. And one of the things that's very notable about mania in its extreme, as in bipolar disorder, individuals who are manic think that they can solve all the problems of the world, and they want to talk to you about it right away because they think it needs to get going. And I mean all the problems of the world. This could be a friend of yours for 5 years, and all at once they say, you know what? I know how to solve all these wars, and I can do it in one day. You need to help me get in touch with the president so that I can give him his plan, and they are dead serious, right? And so mania is just a massive amount of hopefulness, right? And this sense of grandeur that is actually hard, it's shocking when you hear it, right? But this is a case of the extreme cases. In less extreme cases, the mania may be more focused and less broad to the world. But the ones you hear about mainly are generally related to more grand ideas. So grand ideas, cognitive thinking, grandiose planning is often a component. Indiscriminate decision-making. They think their decision is right regardless of any comparison to other possible decisions they could have made, basically. They often have racing thoughts in mania, easily distracted. They're impulsive, and they have a very high degree of self-confidence and self-esteem during that time. And mania is always cyclic, which means they're going to come down from that. And if they come down to that, they may come down to kind of a healthy level, or it may be a depressive level. And then the cognition changes to being an inability to even make a decision. Really slow thought processes. They feel slow. You think they're slow. Can't understand why they can't move through a sentence a little bit faster. They have excessive worry, and they ruminate. Does everybody know what we mean by ruminating? Ruminating is a big term in clinical psychology. Constantly thinking about it, going through it in their mind. Like when you do something dumb when you're out, you ruminate for a couple of days. That's what you're doing. You're ruminating, basically. But people who are depressed ruminate for an excessive amount of time over things that you're like, oh, just drop it, who cares, right? And they often have a high degree of guilt and self-blame, and they evaluate themselves very negatively, much more negatively than you would, and it's frustrating to you because you can see that this is a problem and that they just need to stop it because it's just totally unrealistic. And so these are kind of what you expect these depressive symptoms to look like. And they also come with behavioral symptoms, which is so interesting about depression. To diagnose it, you have to think about the person's emotions, their ability to think, and then their behavior, and they're quite opposite, right? So depressed individuals often have to sleep a lot, they're tired, they're exhausted, they have no energy. In contrast, people who have mania can go like that bunny in the battery commercial, just go, 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 go. And depressed individuals often want to sleep, but then can't actually fall asleep. And they have slow speech and slow movement, and this is very irritating to the individuals around them typically. In contrast, people with mania speak at a mile an answer. I prepare for mania every time I come to this class, so I can go as fast as I can. And depressed people are socially withdrawn, and manic people are increasingly sociable. They often spend enormous amounts of money getting everybody to be social with them, but often they're actually, the people around them are a little bit put off typically in the end by how overly social they are. Okay, any questions about that? Remember, it's unlikely we have any bipolar people here, right? Like 1% of the population. It's very small. But you all may experience states of mania and states of depression. And while we wouldn't call that optimal health, it may not be called psychopathology either. It can be somewhere in that continuum. It depends how long it lasts and how severe it is. If you go and spend $100,000 in one night, you may have a pathological case of mania, right? Right? And don't laugh, because this is often what stops them. And this is how they get institutionalized, because they just went and bought just crazy things, basically. Okay, so do we have any more time? I have 3 minutes. Can I continue for 3 minutes? Thank you. What are the symptoms of depression? Sadness, feelings of worthlessness, anhedonia, changes in their sleep, changes in what they eat. They can either eat too much or eat too little. They are tired. They have no interest in doing anything. You keep on trying to ask them to go out, and they're like, yeah, no one likes me. I don't want to go out. They don't want to go out. I have to go out because no one likes me, but I can't go out because no one likes me. This is what happens, basically, right? So they tell you they want desperately to go do something fun, and then they're not interested in actually doing it. They're very indecisive. They're often very suicidal, so that's something to always keep in mind. And it has to be long-lasting, months probably, rather than just a few days. What about mania then? Oh, and what do we call this? And I'll stop with this slide then. Remember, this can be called major depressive disorder. This is a very different diagnosis than depression alone. As we use the term depression to talk about both pathological and really mild, probably normal cases of sadness and depression. But if you're diagnosed with major depressive disorders, it's very problematic, and it's often very episodic, right? So you're like 4 months on, 4 months off, 4 months on, and that sort of distinguishes us from this kind of low-grade bummed outness that we might also call depression. When you have that low-grade depression, it's sometimes referred to as dysthymia, right? It's less severe, but it's kind of continuous. It's not cyclic. And we sometimes call it unipolar depression because there's no mania that goes with it, right? Okay. And the most common type of mood disorder is depression without mania. 40 years of depression on this, so what can I do? All right, you guys, if I don't see you on Tuesday, I still will have Top Hat questions for you. And in addition, I hope you have a nice Thanksgiving. Thanks. Don't forget that if you don't come on Tuesday, you should have to punish yourself by watching the video, which I consider punishing. I've had to watch the videos. They're punishing, huh? Oh, I mean Monday. What did I say, Tuesday? Yeah. You know, passive aggressiveness. I don't really like teaching on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, and so I never can remember the day. And that's just passive aggressive. That's what Freud would say.
I just have a question.
Sure.
So, talking about diagnosing someone